All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to be talking about using Gatsby and Drupal together. If that's what you're expecting, you're in the right room. If that's not what you were expecting, you're not in the right room, and that's fine. You can stay and hang out, and we'll talk about it anyways. My name is Joe. I am eojthebrave on Twitter and Drupal.org and most other. I work for a company called Drupalize.me. We produce Drupal training, speak at events like this, and generally are just into participating in the Drupal community. Today I'm going to be talking about a handful of different things. I'm going to spend a little bit of time initially talking about what is Gatsby and why you might want to use it for a project. I'll talk quite a bit about how you can use Gatsby in conjunction with Drupal. And then I'll talk a little bit about just sort of in general using the two tools together to build websites that are, oh my god, super fast. It's going to be cool. As an example of the type of thing that we're talking about, let's see if this actually works. Play my video. Is it going to work? Is it going to work? Come on. There it goes. This is an example of the website that I'm going to be talking about building. This website is built using Gatsby. It uses Drupal in the backend to source all of its content. So all the content you're seeing on the pages here comes from Drupal. What you're seeing, the HTML, is generated by Gatsby. I tried to illustrate with this video that one of the things that was really exciting for me about Gatsby when I first started messing around with it a little bit was just how fast the pages were that it created. And so I tried to create a video where it was like, watch, I click here and then it transitions to the next. Well, that's not what I'm seeing, but okay. The example here goes off, uses a Gatsby site with a Drupal backend in order to allow users to log into the site and view protected content. It has OAuth installed in Drupal, user accounts in Drupal. You can sign into them via OAuth. This is similar to the sign in with Google or sign in with Facebook, or apparently now sign in with Apple buttons that we're going to see everywhere. But using Drupal as the backend for that authentication. We're going to skip the video because it's giving me problems and I can't even see what it's showing you. Why talk about Gatsby at a Drupal event, I think there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's something that people are increasingly using as a tool to build Drupal sites. For me, in particular, I first got interested in it because I wanted to learn a little bit more about using React and GraphQL, which are two sort of newer technologies, newer in the sense that Drupal is a really old technology anyways, that people are using to build front-end clients for web applications. Gatsby is a really cool way to learn how to use React and how to learn GraphQL. For me, it allowed me to work on a project that involved real data right away, because Gatsby kind of does a lot of the work of sort of scaffolding your application so that you can get right down to actually like implementing things in React that do solve real problems. Versus spending a lot of time setting up the scaffolding so that you could actually even just view the React application. And for me, I learn better when I'm working on like real things and with real data. I wanted to spend a little bit of time kind of experimenting with decoupled architectures, so scenarios where you're using Drupal as the backend for one or more different front-end clients, whether those clients are a website or an application on a phone or a Roku app on a TV. Just kind of play with that a little bit and how to do that with Drupal 8. And finally, I think that as web developers, we should always be looking at ways to improve our existing skill set, and this was definitely one of those for me. So what is Gatsby? According to the Gatsby website, Gatsby is a blazing fast application generator for React, whatever that means. It is an open source tool that is written in Node.js. So the Gatsby code itself and the Gatsby client is written in Node.js. As a person who is using Gatsby to create applications, you'll primarily write React code and use GraphQL in order to access data. You potentially will write a little bit of Node as well, but primarily it's going to be working with React and React components. Gatsby is open source. It's kind of unlike Drupal. It has the scenario here is that there is Gatsby, the project, so gatsbyjs.org, and then there's also Gatsby Inc., the commercial entity that supports the Gatsby open source project, which is gatsbyjs.com. This is kind of similar to WordPress, where Automatic is sort of the commercial entity that owns, if anyone can own, WordPress. In this sense, their Gatsby Inc. kind of does the bulk of the work on the Gatsby project, helps provide direction for the project, etc. Though there are also tons of contributors working on it as well. And then in addition to being written in, or using React and GraphQL to write the code, one of the things that's neat about Gatsby is it provides a really cool developer experience. Things that are often hard to emulate with Drupal, like for example, the ability to type a couple lines of CSS, hit save, and have it automatically hot reloaded in the browser so you can see the changes that you've made right away. Gatsby allows for some cool developer experience like that. And its most basic, Gatsby does this. It takes React components, it infuses them with data from GraphQL. You could think of this as similar to how Twig works with Drupal. When you view a page in Drupal, Drupal extracts data from the database, it feeds it into a Twig template that's rendered into some representation, HTML DOM, and that's served to the browser. Gatsby does a similar thing. It takes data, it feeds it into React components. Whatever the DOM those React components create, it saves as an HTML file and serves that HTML file to your browser. And ta-da! You can view a website because it's HTML. So this would be a very, very simple version where it's just a pretty simple React component with some text hard-coded into it. That would work just fine. In reality, you'll probably end up using more dynamic components where instead of hard-coding things like hi friend or hello world, similar to Twig, you might do like curly braces title. And that would be dynamically replaced with the content that is inserted into the component. We'll look at that a bunch. I said that Gatsby is blazing, and I decided I needed to figure out a little bit more about what that means. So I like this quote. When evaluating libraries, check if it's blazing fast. If it's fast, but the README doesn't specify whether its fastness is blazing, just keep searching. Often, you can find a similar library that does the same thing, but blazingly. And apparently, blazing means good. I think that, like in more human speak, we can translate this to mean that websites that are fast are better websites. They're better for our users, they're better for search engine optimization. Pretty much anything that you want to do on a website, if it does it faster, that's better than doing it not faster. This example comes from a presentation that Adi Asmani gave, where he talked. I mean, I'm sure you've all encountered this before. You go to view a web page, something in the DOM loads really quick, but you can't actually do anything with it because you're waiting for the JavaScript to parse in the background, or more likely, you're waiting for some ad to load. So you're sitting there like hitting the button that you can see, and it does nothing because the page hasn't finished parsing yet. Measuring the time to interactivity. There's a bunch of other examples of this, but certainly this is one of the more frustrating ones. Okay, cool. So blazing means good because websites that are fast are better for search engines, they're better for business, they're more accessible. I read a report that said that, I believe it was released by Google, that for every 5-second decrease in the time that it takes a page to load, businesses on average see a 2 times increase in their ad revenue. So just making your pages faster can really impact the bottom line of your site, assuming that it's based on ad revenue anyway. Cool, so we can all agree, blazing means good. So what do you have to do to get websites that are blazing fast? It's really easy. You just need to understand all of the different ways that the web works and implement those patterns. Things like HTTP2 for allowing for multiple resources to be streamed over a single HTTP connection, implementing patterns like PRPL and Rail and Flip, so making sure that you're loading content and caching it before a user gets it, or making sure that all of your CSS and JavaScript animations are fast and performant. Maybe you want to build a single-page web application. You want to measure things like time to interactivity and time to first paint and first meaningful paint and first contentful paint. And maybe it should be a progressive web app instead of just a single-page web app. You need to measure time to first byte. There's a lot of different things that we talk about and think about when we're trying to make websites that are blazing fast. Luckily, this is more of a science than an art. Most of these are well-known patterns that if you understand how the patterns work, you can implement the pattern. Or they're things that you can objectively measure, like time to first paint or first meaningful paint. These are statistics that we can measure, we can make adjustments, and see if it changes that number, see if our sites are faster or not. In order to make these things happen, all you have to do is things like make sure that all of the content you're serving to the browser is minified and compressed, that you do things like code splitting and scope hoisting, so making sure that you're only sending the code that is required for a specific page for a request. Tree shaking is if you imagine like you write a bunch of CSS rules and you send the CSS file along with the request for a page, but like 80% of those rules aren't used on the page. That's just extra bloat that's being sent to the browser for that specific page that's not being used. Tree shaking is the process of saying, let's eliminate all of the CSS that's not actually going to be used for anything on this page. A bunch of things that we know how to do and aren't necessarily hard from a technical perspective, but they're definitely tedious to implement. So luckily, one of the things that's awesome about Gatsby is it does most of these things for you. Gatsby is designed to be incredibly performant out of the box. You get route-based code splitting, automatically inlining critical resources. It implements things like the PRPL pattern. So route-based code splitting would be being intelligent about saying, this page requires this JavaScript path and this JavaScript path and this bit of CSS in order for the page to work or for this route to work. So let me split all of the code up so that only the code that's required for this route is in the bundle that's sent to the browser. Inlining critical resources is doing things like saying, taking the parts of the page that are absolutely critical for it to be and feel performant and inlining them into the HTML DOM instead of making a separate request to get them. So you could say the logo for a page is probably potentially like a critical element that you want to make sure it's there. You want it to be really fast. So one technique would be to take that logo and base64 encode the image and insert that right into the HTML of the page instead of making a separate HTTP request to load the image. And it's slightly more performant if you do it that way, generally speaking. Prefetch and pre-cache is a pretty cool thing where when you are, it's a pattern for, you come to a website and there's a bunch of links on the homepage and they all point to other pages on the same site. And so you can start to feel like relatively sure, hey, they're on this page. Probably one of the next ones that they're going to go to is one of these things that's linked in the main navigation or in the body of the page. And so prefetch and pre-cache, what it does is essentially like as a link becomes visible in the browser's viewport, assuming the page is loaded and the browser is not currently doing anything else, there's some JavaScript that will go and say, you know what, this points at the About page. There's a high chance that the user is going to click the link to go there. So I'm just going to go ahead and fetch the content of that page and stick it in the browser's cache while I'm sitting here doing nothing because they're reading the homepage. And if they do happen to click that link, then I don't even need to make any requests to get that page because I already have its content. You can just load it directly from the browser's cache. This is the thing that's sort of like, it makes something feel a lot more performant. We can talk about image optimizations. So things like a common pattern that you see on a lot of websites now is when you first go to the page, it'll load like a really small, 10 pixel by 10 pixel version of the image, stretch it out so it looks really blurry. The rest of the page will load, and then the image will kind of progressively load a higher and higher resolution version until you get the like super high DPI version for your Retina display. And again, it's all about making the page feel fast for the end user. And so Gatsby has built into it, without you having to do anything else, it does these things for you. And I think that's interesting to think about too, because there's nothing that prevents you from doing all of these things with Drupal. You can configure Drupal to prefetch and pre-cache routes. You can inline critical resources in your Twig templates in a Drupal theme. There are all kinds of things you can do with image optimizations. But out of the box, Drupal doesn't do these things for you, and it does require quite a bit of additional work to set them up and get it all working. As a static site generator, one of the things that Gatsby does is it acts as a sort of templating system where it sources data from somewhere, it applies a template to it, generates static HTML files from that data, and then those HTML files are what are served to the browser. If you've ever worked with static site generators before, you've probably seen things like Jekyll or GitHub pages, or basically read in a Markdown file, transform it into HTML, ta-da, you have a website. Gatsby does that, but it also allows you to source your content from just about anywhere, which I think is one of the things that's kind of unique about Gatsby in the space of static site generators or static application generators. Gatsby uses what are called source plugins. And effectively what a source plugin does is it's some code that understands Gatsby's data storage system, and it says, at build time, go off and get content from whatever source plugin is installed, pull all of that in, and assemble it into a GraphQL database at runtime that then I, as a Gatsby developer, when I want to access the data, I just write GraphQL queries. I write GraphQL queries. I don't just write them. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to write them. And pull the data into my React component and create HTML pages that way. One of the things that's neat about this is you could set Gatsby up to say, pull some content from Drupal, pull some content from Markdown files, pull some content from a Google spreadsheet, assemble it all into a single data storage, this GraphQL database, and then the developer whose responsibility is make the data look like something, it has a single unified source to query for all of that data instead of having to make requests to a bunch of different APIs that possibly use like different libraries and so forth. Gatsby works great with Markdown. like every other static site or application generator. And the simplest version of a Gatsby page that you probably would build is something that reads in content from Markdown files and turns them into HTML. I don't intend for you to read all of this code, but this is an example of what the code would be that does that. On the left-hand side is some Node.js code that implements the Gatsby API and says, hey, go ahead and after all the data has been sourced using the source plugin, go ahead and run this GraphQL query that gets the list of all of the content from the Markdown files that were imported, loop over the results that are returned, make a list of all of the pages that Gatsby is going to build, and then say, use this template to build them. The template then is a React component, and the data is inserted into that component dynamically. So your title from your Markdown page, the body copy, etc. You output it using standard React and end up with a HTML DOM that Gatsby then saves as a .html file, and ta-da, you have a website, more or less. Kind of like in Drupal, if the question is like, can I do that with Drupal? The answer is, yeah, there's probably a module for that. In Gatsby, especially when it comes to sourcing content from somewhere, there's probably a plugin for that. Gatsby makes use of plugins in a very similar way to how Drupal makes use of modules. The plugins extend Gatsby's base functionality to do a handful of different things. Source plugins and transform plugins are the ones that you'll see kind of most commonly used. Source plugins say, hey, these are different things that I can extract data from. So we'll talk a lot about the Gatsby source Drupal plugin, which says this is how Gatsby knows how to communicate with Drupal and pull data in from there. Transform plugins are plugins that operate on the data that has been sourced from somewhere and inserted into the GraphQL storage. So Gatsby uses this for doing things like image optimization and manipulation. It says, hey, I got an image from Drupal. Before you make use of it, do these different transformation steps on it to make it, create a bunch of different variants of it that I can use for a progressive enhancement or something like that. So that's a bit about Gatsby and kind of in general how it works. Why use Drupal with Gatsby? And I think this is an important question because Gatsby does give you the opportunity to pull data from really just about anywhere. And commonly you'll see people using things like Markdown files as a source for content, or other sort of popular software as a service platforms like Contentful or Firebase that allow editors to create content in a database, and Gatsby can source from there. I think that Drupal is a really good fit for this kind of workflow. For kind of all of the reasons that we already use Drupal. Things like the fact that Markdown isn't really an editorial experience that most users can get behind. It's a file that most users can maybe read and understand. Drupal has really powerful data modeling tools. I mean, this is a big part of why we use it for all of the sites that we build, the field API and the entity API. What this means is that Drupal can structure its data in a way that is easy for a tool like Gatsby to consume and to make sense of the data that it's getting. Drupal provides for really powerful, complex editorial workflows. I think this is kind of one of the most powerful features of Drupal, is your ability to, as a Drupal developer or a site builder, you can customize the workflow that someone goes through when they're creating and editing content within Drupal, and you can make that experience unique for each website and each particular application. This is a thing that many other tools can do a little bit of, but not nearly to the extent that Drupal can. Drupal gives you really fine-grained access control over all of the data that you put into it, which I think is, again, something that is relatively unique about it. And then, so maybe most importantly, when you're kind of considering the decision of like, should I use Drupal for a project in general, but also like in conjunction with Gatsby, I think one of the biggest selling points of Drupal are it's open source, which means it's self-hosted, so you own your data versus your data existing in some platform like Contentful that you don't really own, and you own your code. it's open source. You can make any changes to the code you want. All of these things we've talked about, like modifying the editorial workflow, you can do that with Drupal in a way that you can't with most hosted platforms. And do cool things like this, like say, hey, my workflow requires that authors can create a new piece of content, but then the content, before it can be published, needs to go through technical review, and then the technical reviewer needs to pass it on to a copy editor, and then they get a style review, and then it needs to get scheduled for publication rather than being published right now because I need all of these things to be released next Friday. And you can set up workflows like this that are truly unique to your specific use case. Drupal also works really well as a backend for scenarios where you've got multiple different clients that need to access the data. And that's in part due to how well it does at providing structured data with the entity and field API. And so another time where Drupal might be a really good use case is a scenario where you've maybe got a primary website that is the place that most people are going to go, and then maybe you've got a handful of other websites that are more brochure or kind of like teasers for something that your business is doing, and maybe you build those with Gatsby. You've got business partners that you need to share the content that people are putting into your database with. Maybe you've got an Apple TV or Roku app, kind of all kinds of scenarios. And Drupal's really good at that. So all you need to do the only thing you need to do with Drupal in order to make it work with Gatsby is install the JSON API module. And actually, all you need to do now is just install Drupal because as of Drupal 8.7, JSON API is included in Drupal core. So really, you just need to enable the module. The JSON API module is one of many ways, kind of the primary one that takes the structured data that Drupal has in its database for all of your content types, et cetera, and turns it into a machine-readable format, JSON in this case. Gatsby can then consume that JSON data and import it or source it into its GraphQL data store. In addition to the JSON API module, I also recommend taking a look at JSON API extras. JSON API module is really cool because you just turn it on and it just works. You don't have to do anything. It's a zero config module. So you turn it on and ta-da, you have a REST API to interact with all of your site's content. And then it's like literally all of your site's content. So it's nice to turn on JSON API extras because it turns out you probably actually don't need an API for like block configuration and things like that. And JSON API extras, what it does primarily is it allows you to disable various resources that you don't need to make public. When working with Gatsby, this is important because it can help speed up the build time of your Gatsby sites because what Gatsby will do is it essentially just traverses your JSON API tree and pulls in every bit of data it can find. And that's cool, except for probably you're only using like 10% of the things that Drupal is exposing via JSON API. So you can speed up that build process by just disabling the things that you're not using. And then the simple OAuth module, if you want to provide a way for users or applications to authenticate against your Drupal site via something that's a little bit more cross-platform than session-based authentication. So session-based is like what happens when you navigate to the site in your browser, you type in your username and password, it sets a session and a cookie in your browser, and ta-da, next time you come back, you're still logged into that same page. OAuth allows for the exchange of access tokens. And so tools that don't have a traditional session, like for example a Roku application, can maintain that token and keep you logged in across sessions. There is a distribution of Drupal called Contenta, which takes the JSON API module and simple OAuth and a handful of others and installs and pre-configures them in a way that I think is a useful starting point, especially if this is kind of your first foray into using Drupal as more of the back end of in a decoupled architecture. It also installs a handful of other modules that help provide documentation for your API and things like that are pretty cool. What all of this does, once you've got it installed, is it allows your users of your Drupal application to get a beautiful interface where they can edit content and add images and transition things through workflows, and represents all of that data in a machine-readable format, JSON API in this case, that tools like Gatsby or many others can consume. I also kind of, going back to like the idea that you can build static applications that source content from Markdown. I often think about like one of the powerful things here is like you can't do this with a Markdown file. You can't provide users with an editorial experience that allows them to upload images and crop them and choose different images to use at different viewport sizes and things like that, at least not in any kind of intuitive way. One of the things about JSON API that makes it powerful in this case is that JSON API is a known specification. It's a spec that says if you have data that you want to represent as JSON, here's a pattern that you can follow to do it. And here's how you can link between different resources. So here's how, for example, an entity reference can be represented. Here's how images can be represented. Here's how to handle pagination and so forth. Because it's a known specification, tools like Gatsby that can implement that specification don't need to know anything about the specific details of your Drupal site. They just need to know that it implements the JSON API spec, and they can read all of its data. So with Gatsby, in order to source data from Drupal, it really is as simple as installing the Gatsby source Drupal plugin, and then in your Gatsby configuration, telling it where the endpoint of Drupal's JSON API is. And that's it. At this point, when you run Gatsby's build process, the Gatsby source Drupal plugin is smart about understanding JSON API. It goes and it sees a list like this, and it says, okay, here's all the things that the Drupal site has. I know how to read the content of each of these, and it goes in and starts pulling all of the content into its GraphQL database. Again, this is also like why you maybe want to start to disable things, because a lot of this you might not need when you're creating the front-end client. It's like, I probably don't need Gatsby to know about all the different roles that I have configured on my Drupal site. You might, but probably not. So once that's happened, once Gatsby has sourced all of its content from Drupal, essentially what you get in Gatsby's GraphQL database is a representation of all of the nodes or pieces of content that have been created in Drupal. And this pretty much reflects the structure of your data in Drupal. So if you create a field in Drupal that's named like field underscore, like is this a good thing, yes or no, and it's a Boolean field. It's a dumb field, but it'll be pulled into Gatsby, and you'll have a GraphQL field that has that same name, the same data type, etc. There are a couple of exceptions to that. Like, for example, Gatsby doesn't directly import things like the UUID from a Drupal entity or the node ID, like NID. It changes the field name for Drupal UUID and NID to have this Drupal underscore prefix. The reason for that is that Gatsby also assigns a UUID in its GraphQL store to every piece of content. And because it could source content from multiple locations, you don't want to end up with potential conflicts there. In this example, I have a site in Drupal that has a bunch of tutorials. They're getting consumed into the Gatsby GraphQL database. Here I've written a GraphQL query that says, give me a list of all of the IDs, titles, and the path alias for the content that was in Drupal. Loop over that content. Here, using Gatsby's create page API, you're effectively looping through a list and saying, for each of the things in this list, create a new page. Here's the route that I would like you to create that page at. Here's the template that I would like you to use to generate the HTML. Example, it's using the path alias from Drupal. So if an editor in Drupal alias this URL, instead of node/42, they made it tutorial/unicorns on the Gatsby site, it would use the same route, which is kind of a neat thing. And then it uses whatever this React component is to figure out what HTML to generate for the page. I wonder what I wanted to talk about here. This is not Gatsby Code. This is Drupal code. This is an implementation of Drupal's hook entity field access. And in my use case, what I needed to do was restrict access to some of the content on the site. And when you think of Gatsby consuming data from Drupal, by default, it's going to act as an anonymous user. So the only data that's going to be sucked into its GraphQL data store is things that an anonymous user can see. There are ways that you can tell it to, like you can give Gatsby a username and password and say, source data as this authenticated user. But keep in mind that things that it can only see what an anonymous user can see by default. This means you can do things like have content in Drupal that Gatsby by default can't see. This is an implementation of that where it's just saying, hey, if this tutorial is not marked as free, hide the content of the body field, but go ahead and continue to spit out the summary field. And so Gatsby will, instead of like the full body of the tutorial, it'll just have a summary that it can work with. And this is interesting because I think one of the things that's most powerful about Gatsby is the ability to use it to create not just a static HTML web application, but to actually create like a progressive web application or a single page application. Because of the fact that Gatsby sites are built using React components, you can effectively do anything that React can do. So you can write a full React application that is used to create static HTML for a Gatsby site. Now, React can do things. It can do anything that JavaScript can do, which means that we can create a site that effectively acts initially as a static application, but once it's loaded and React is doing its thing, we can authenticate users and personalize the page based on who's visiting it and so forth. These are things that are traditionally not possible with static applications. It's like, whatever HTML you got when the build process was run, that's it. That's the version of the page that people can see. This works because React has a utility called Hydrate. If you think of React as a tool that manages the state of the HTML DOM for a page, how this works is you have some React components and you feed them some data, and it takes that data and it says, okay, based on the data that you just gave me, this is what the HTML output should look like. Now, if you were to change any of that data, React has the ability to re-render a particular component or the entire page and say, hey, the title changed, or the user went from anonymous to authenticated. Do I need to change anything about the state of the DOM? And it makes some changes, and then it gives that new version of the DOM to your browser, and that's what you see. When Gatsby runs initially as an anonymous user, it gets some data fed into it. It creates some representation of the HTML DOM based on the data that you gave it, and then it saves that data as a static HTML file, and that's the static part of what Gatsby is doing. After that HTML is loaded, React is still present. It's part of the application. So the static HTML is loaded. React is then, essentially it's like poured into your existing HTML DOM. I think of this as like save states for video games. So you're playing a video game and you've spent a couple of hours progressing across some world. You get to a point where you're like, oh man, I'm about to fight this boss, and I want to make sure that I have a place that I can go back to in case things go wrong, so you hit save. And it writes out some data to a file that says the current state of Joe is like he has 32 health and 4 swords, and he's standing on top of this volcano. And then you go and do whatever it is, and you die or you get hungry and you go have breakfast, and then you come back and you say, you know what, I want to resume that state. So you load the data from the file, and the application takes that state information and it puts you had and the weapons that you had equipped, or whatever the case may be. That's effectively what React Hydrate does. It says, at any given point, you can save the state of a React application as an HTML file, and then Hydrate says, load that saved state back into the application. I'll display it at that state, but then it is, from that point forth, it's a full application that you can interact with just as you would have prior to it. Does that make sense? Kinda? Yeah. In this case, I think why that's important is it means that Gatsby writes out a static HTML file, which you can then serve to the user as a representation of the page that they're going to visit. So they go to your About page, and they get the about.html file. It loads super fast because it is just static HTML. After the HTML is loaded, the JavaScript bundle that's attached to that. So all the JavaScript code is loaded after they're seeing the HTML. Once the JavaScript's been loaded, React Hydrate is called, and it looks at the HTML DOM and it says, this is a React application. I can tell because the current state of this DOM is a React application. Instead of starting the application from scratch, like I would normally do, what I'm going to do instead is start from whatever this state represents. After that, it's not just a static HTML page anymore. It is now actually a full React application. So whatever that JavaScript code was going to do based on the current state, it will continue to do from that point. So you can do after the page is loaded, use JavaScript to make an additional HTTP request to Drupal that authenticates the user or finds out additional information about a particular page. A couple examples of how this might work using Gatsby are hybrid pages, and I think this is an approach that works really well for things like pages that have a whole bunch of content on it that is primarily static, that is primarily the same for every single person that's going to view the page, and maybe small parts of the page that vary per user. In this example, this is a schedule from DrupalCon. Every single one of us, when we go to this page, the schedule's the same for all of us. These titles, the room that it's in, that information is identical for everybody. The only thing that changes is this Add to My Schedule button. And so the things that change are when I click on this, it needs to add it to my schedule, not to somebody else's schedule. And it also needs to represent that I actually have some things in my schedule already, so the button needs to be different in that case. In a hybrid page workflow, what you could do is build a static version of this page that includes everything except for this Add to Schedule button. And so the page would load, and you would see all the content of the page, and maybe just a placeholder here. Or maybe you even just see the button. This is the annoying. You see the button, but when you click on it, it doesn't do anything. Once the page has completely loaded and React has hydrated the application, in the background, React can go, oh, you're Joe. Let me request your schedule from Drupal and pull in that information and then apply it to this page. So the experience that you get is an initial page load that's super fast because it's static HTML with nothing else really going on. You get this additional information added to the page that is useful for you. I'm not touching it, I swear. Another approach to this is you could create client-only routes. You could think of a client-only route as being a page where the vast majority of the content on the page is unique to the person that's viewing it. So in this case, when I go and view the page at my schedule, this content is going to be different for me than it is for anybody else. And so in this case, you might do something like render a static container, kind of everything around the main content as static HTML, and then this part loads in the background after the rest of the page is loaded. You see this all of the time with things like Facebook. When you navigate to a page, you see this everywhere on the internet now. You go to the page and it loads really fast, but all it loads is a bunch of gray bars that are going like this inside of a container, and then eventually your content loads into it. In your React code or in your Gatsby code, this is what that implementation looks like. Basically, it boils down to, I've got two different React components here. One that says, hey, render a full version of a tutorial that includes all of the content for a logged in user. Here's another component that just renders a trimmed down version or a teaser of the tutorial for an anonymous user. When Gatsby renders the static version of the page, it's an anonymous user. It sees this tutorial teaser component. That's the HTML that's saved as the static HTML for the page. When you first view the page, that's what you see, is this teaser version of the tutorial. After the application's been hydrated, it's like, oh, whoa, Joe, welcome back. I can see that you're logged in. So React does a state change, which triggers it to re-render this particular component. But this time it's like, you're logged in. I'll use the full tutorial version. And you get the full tutorial of the page. So, this is what I just said. This is a slide. The full tutorial version of this component here is this is a React component. The portion down here is determining what the HTML representation of the page should be. Up at the top, under the component did mount, that's saying after this particular piece of HTML has been mounted into the DOM, go ahead and do this code. And the code that I've got here is make a request to Drupal's JSON API to get the full representation of this node, which includes the content that is only available for logged in users. Once you've gotten that, use that data to populate the component instead of what was in GraphQL. I've got a demo of this, which will hopefully help make it make a little bit more sense. Except for, let's do this. All right, this is the GatsbyGuides.com site, which we were talking about. And if you scroll down and click on any of these links, they're super fast, which is cool. It takes you to a tutorial page. I remember like when I first started playing with building these pages with Gatsby, I would spend a bunch of time just like clicking the link and being like, whoa, that loaded really, whoa. And then I would go find my wife, Sarah, and I'd be like, Sarah, look at how fast this loads. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to click the button. And I'm like, no, you click the button. But it was fun. I had a lot of fun with that. And yay, it loads fast. In this case, it's kind of hard to see because it does load so fast. But you'll notice it's loading some content at the top of the page in those lovely gray bars at the bottom of the page and then filling in the rest of the page. That's because I'm currently logged in. And so what it's doing is when I view the page, initially it's showing the teaser version of the content, loading the rest of it in the background. As soon as it's like, you're authenticated, you can view this, it inserts that into the page. That's kind of the React has hydrated this application and now it's just acting as a single page app. If I log out and I navigate around, I only ever see the teaser version of the page. See if I can still log in. I go back to the page. Wah wah. You get the updated version. Yeah. And so kind of a quick recap. Some of the things that I've enjoyed about working with Gatsby, Gatsby builds sites that are super fast, and that's pretty fun. Gatsby builds React applications, and for me, it was a really cool way to learn a bit more about React because I was working with real data for a real application versus building just another to-do list or a hello world application. Gatsby primary differentiator between it and other static site generators is its ability to source data from a whole bunch of different locations, not just Markdown files or just Drupal, but pretty much anything you can imagine. You can teach Gatsby to source data from it. And then the fact that the pages that it's building aren't static HTML or just static HTML, they are actually React applications. Yeah, that's what I got. If you're curious and want to know more, you can check out the GatsbyGuides.com site, which is a bunch of tutorials that talk about how I built the GatsbyGuides.com site, which is kind of where this presentation came from. I'll also be around the rest of the conference, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm also happy to ask questions. Thanks for coming. And also, if people have questions right now, until they kick me out, I'm happy to try to answer them. I'll turn this off.